Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. So, in many ways, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has gotten a lot more complicated in the past few years. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think it's notable. The recent Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is probably the most obvious example of this. That's a movie that's technically already a sequel to the first Doctor Strange, but if you just sat down and watched them both back to back with no other context, you would be woefully unprepared. Multiverse of Madness is a movie that expects you to have done some homework. WandaVision, the first Doctor Strange, Infinity War, Endgame, even No Way Home. So many things are woven into the text of Multiverse of Madness in one way or another. Now, if you're a loyal MCU fan, that's often a feature, not a bug. It's great to feel like your investment and time spent with this franchise meant something, like you're seeing the building blocks of a grand narrative being assembled brick by brick. But there's another perspective that I think is worth considering, even if the majority of my viewers may not relate with it much. That more casual viewer that the MCU, in its bid to conquer TV along with film, may be leaving behind. Now, the MCU expecting viewers to be caught up with its ongoing narratives is nothing new. Something like Captain America Civil War doesn't really work if you've only seen the previous Captain America films. You won't be completely lost, but it's clear that the viewer is expected to be familiar with Iron Man and the Avengers at large. And these are some of the biggest movies in the world, so that's not exactly a super risky bet to make. But I think there's a really big difference between then and now in terms of how committed you're expected to be. When Civil War came out in 2016, the MCU had basically kept a steady clip of 2 films a year since 2013. Before that, there were some gaps, like 2009 when they didn't release anything, or 2010 and 2012 where they only released 1 film. On the whole though, 2 a year was definitely the norm. In 2017, they decided that their schedule could support 3, and I think they were right, as Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Spider-Man Homecoming, and Thor Ragnarok were all released to solid critical acclaim and big box office numbers. In 2018 and 2019, they kept up that pace, and for the most part, it kept working, wrapping up Phase 3 with Far From Home. Now obviously 2020 marked a massive shift, with both a new phase on the horizon and most theaters around the world being shut down. But then 2021 was just an entirely different story than any MCU release schedule that came before it. Not only were there more movies, with a whopping 4 MCU films, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Now there was also 4 MCU shows, very directly tied into Phase 4 as well. The MCU, which not all that long ago had been a twice-a-year event, was now consistently with us in some form or another. Now obviously, there had been shows that were kind of connected to the MCU already. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. being the obvious one, but also the Netflix shows and Freeform's Cloak and Dagger. But no matter what ABC's marketing team would want you to believe, it was generally understood that these were tangentially related at best. No one sitting down for Endgame had to worry about catching up on Iron Fist Season 2. Now the Disney Plus shows are an entirely different story. WandaVision was essential to the story of Doctor Strange 2. Sure, you could watch it without having seen the show, but you'd definitely feel a bit behind. You really needed to have seen it to get the full experience, and I'm sure some of you will disagree, but I think that's a pretty huge ask. I've loved superheroes about as long as I can remember, but even I could feel my enthusiasm slowly waning when firing up another episode of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. This isn't to say that I think all the Disney Plus shows are bad. A lot of people in the comments actually took issue with how much I enjoyed Loki. But they are definitely adding another layer of commitment to the universe that I think may ultimately prove to be a problem for the MCU. And in many ways, it's not completely different from the comic book universes that gave birth to these stories. The 60s Marvel boom was hugely accessible, giving readers young and old characters that they could relate to, that had problems that balanced the fantastic and the grounded. Who couldn't relate to the Thing feeling like he doesn't fit in, or Spider-Man struggles to balance his responsibilities and his friends and family? But as the fanbase grew more hardcore, the comics followed suit. To completely understand the Marvel Comics universe now is nearly a full-time job, with solo titles always stopping and starting, and massive events constantly making it difficult to just follow one character. Eventually, the universe came to be seen as kind of impenetrable to many casual readers, who once happily bought issues of the Fantastic Four or Amazing Spider-Man with their spare change. And when Marvel Comics tried to remedy this in the early 2000s with the Ultimate line, which served as an easy entry point for new readers, it wasn't long until the exact same problems started plaguing those comics, but on an accelerated timetable. At 2 or even 3 movies a year, I think the MCU was able to avoid that fairly easily. But when you add hours and hours of serialized television to that equation, I think the risk of the universe becoming too convoluted for casual viewers really skyrockets. Now, I will say this has not impacted Marvel too much yet. Multiverse of Madness is doing more than fine at the box office, and maybe the MCU really can bear the weight of these near constant releases, but I'm kind of skeptical. I know that superhero fatigue is now a term that's been around for so long that it's kind of a punchline at this point, because it just keeps failing to really come to pass, but I don't think Marvel has ever really put that to the test like they are now. Between a rocky Phase 4 slate of films that kicked off with a mediocre movie about a character who was already dead, and a series of TV shows that have really had their ups and downs, I think the MCU might be in a more precarious place than it appears. Am I saying it's all going to collapse and soon there's not going to be any Marvel movies? No, definitely not, but I do think that they may need to seriously ratchet back the volume a little bit. Movies like The Eternals and Black Widow get a bit of a pass for their box office performance because they opened under the cloud of the pandemic, but it'll be really interesting to see how things fare from here on out. I think Thor: Love and Thunder will probably do really well. It has the momentum of Ragnarok going for it, and Hemsworth as Thor has always been a really dependable draw. But after that, things get much murkier. I don't want to act like I think everything is doom and gloom for the MCU, but I do think that the Disney Plus shows, regardless of their quality, makes the movies feel a bit less special and far less like big events. Just the very basic problem of how can I miss you if you won't go away. But I will say I don't think it's just the never-ending slate of shows that's causing the problem. Phase 4, by and large, has lacked the sense of narrative momentum that powered earlier phases. After the first Avengers movie, Thanos loomed so large over these films. There were some growing pains. They hadn't really figured that character out at first, but he was a very simple, powerful concept that the movies always felt like they were working towards. Now, the MCU is far more complicated, with a lot more running threads, but there isn't that clear uniting through line. Now, I'm assuming that's what they're setting up Kang the Conqueror to be, but so far since then, there's just not been much momentum there, especially since there doesn't seem to be an Avengers movie on the horizon anytime soon. That and the total misfire of movies like The Eternals have made Phase 4, while certainly not without its highlights, feel pretty disjointed and unfocused overall. It's not that every movie needs to share the same villain or anything like that, but in earlier phases, it always felt like they were building towards something big. Since Endgame, I don't think they've quite been able to recapture that. Maybe this is just a lull in the series, and Kang will prove to be exactly what they need. But when you add in all the TV shows, most of which I could take or leave, honestly, you're just left with so much MCU material I don't find all that engaging. Now, I recognize that I may not be in the majority on this. I know some people love all these shows, but I've never been a fan of TV that prioritizes feeling like a movie that's been stretched to 8 hours long. I like TV that has distinct, creative, individual episodes. Not that they can't be serialized, but that each episode feels like a solid piece of entertainment in and of itself, not just one chapter among many in a very bloated movie. Respecting the concept of an episode is, I think, the main thing that separates genre TV greats like Firefly, Farscape, and Battlestar Galactica from, say, Picard Season 2. The MCU shows aren't nearly as bad as a train wreck like that. Some of them I enjoy a lot, but they do often feel more like overlong movies than TV shows. And I'll happily admit that that probably bothers me specifically more than it does a lot of other people. Still, the reception to most of these shows, especially after the huge early hype of WandaVision, seems to have died down significantly. Like Hawkeye was not that long ago, but I don't see people still talking about it at half the rate that they talk about like Infinity War, let alone something more recent like No Way Home.
That's right, Peter. I'm you, and you're me, and this is a gun.
In the end, I think what I'm looking for is really simple: quality over quantity. Instead of stretching the MCU thin and, in my opinion, devaluing the brand by attaching it to as many projects as they can, they should maybe dial it back a bit and let these things remain as a few big theatrical events. With the X-Men still on the horizon, I know that I would rather have the studio focusing on getting that right instead of dealing with this constant string of TV shows. I think there's still time to avoid the MCU becoming as tangled up and convoluted as the comic book continuity can get. But I do think that that point will arrive, and maybe sooner rather than later. But I want to know what you think. Am I off base here about the MCU, or do you feel a similar way? Would you say this universe is as exciting to you as it was, say, 5 years ago? I'm really interested to read your answers. I'd also really like to thank today's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant has been with the channel for a long time, and I'm always happy to have them, which is funny because honestly at first I found the idea of doing math online pretty intimidating. Thankfully, Brilliant is all about being the interactive learning platform that lets you tackle new math, science, and computer science concepts in fun, hands-on ways. Their course Everyday Math is one that I return to a lot because it helps me become a lot more confident in a topic that I often struggled with as a kid. This gave me a fresh start, focusing on the foundations of math and building your knowledge from the ground up. Because what Brilliant is really great at is giving you the tools you need to tackle these STEM topics head on. With Brilliant, you learn by doing, at your pace and on your own schedule, so it's never been easier to learn these topics on your own terms. So go to brilliant.org/midnight and try it for free, and the first 200 people to go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/midnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.